What I'd like to talk about now is the first of two competitive race relations patterns that we see. Last time we talked a little bit about a paternalistic pattern of racial oppression. Now we want to look at competitive patterns of racial oppression. The first of these is what we call a rigid competitive pattern. In a subsequent video, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we call fluid competitive patterns. But let's start with the fluid competitive pattern. This is a pattern of racial oppression that resembles probably what we could best think of as a kind of unstable caste system. We see that we see this pattern emerging, for example, in the United States in the post-Civil War era from roughly 1877, which was the end of Reconstruction, until the 1940s. It begins to sort of disappear even before the achievements of the Civil Rights era, 64 and 65 with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. But really the thing that comes in and sort of transforms this system of rigid competitive racial oppression to a more fluid system is the labor demands, the significant labor demands of industrial labor demands of the Second World War, right? So we would say that this pattern is pretty dominant in the United States from the late 1870s, so roughly 1877, until the mid 1940s. As I said, it takes the form of an unstable caste system in which racial or ethnic group membership usually determines one's status, but there are obviously going to be some exceptions, right? In a rigid caste system, your racial or ethnic group membership will always determine your position within a system of stratification. Under a rigid competitive system, it is usually determined. There are some exceptions, and that's why this isn't the same thing as one of the reasons why this isn't the same thing as a paternalistic system. So with regard to relative group size, this is a lot more variable. Remember, under a paternalistic system of racial oppression, the dominant group was almost always the minority. Here, it's the case that the dominant group is usually numerically small, but you begin to see some variability here. So sometimes the oppressed group is the smaller group. More often than not, though, I would say still under a rigid competitive system, the subordinated group is still often numerically the majority. The division of labor, again, the way in which the tasks within a particular social organization or social structure are divided up, right? So the division of labor here is organized mostly by race, with some jobs being done by members of the dominant group, and some jobs being done by members of the subordinate group, and then a few jobs that are done by both groups. So it's more complicated and less clear and sort of sharply delineated relative to, say, a paternalistic system. And part of the reason for this is that the broader set of economic conditions is shifting, especially with regard to the impact of technologies in a wide variety of sectors of the economy. So certainly, right, in manufacturing, we're seeing, in this period of time, we're seeing a lot of technological advancements and innovation, but even in agriculture, right, something that was previously very labor intensive, not a lot of technological sophistication, a relatively simple labor intensive process of planting and harvesting. Even in agriculture, we're beginning to see technology have significant impact on how much work is getting done, the nature of the work that's getting done, and how many people and what kinds of people you need to do those jobs. So as specialization is increasing, the division of labor is getting more complex. And as the division of labor is getting more complex, it's harder to maintain a really, really rigid race-based allocation of labor to say that, people who are black are going to go do these jobs and people who are white are going to go do these other jobs. So this this division of labor gets, under rigid competitive racial oppression, gets a lot more complicated. One of the really interesting distinctions has to do with the degree of and frequency of racial interaction. In rigid competitive patterns of racial oppression, there's actually less interaction than there was under paternalism. So there's a high degree of segregation. Again, the separation of groups into separate neighborhoods, into separate communities, workplaces, schools, places of worship, and all of that. So one of the things that happens from 1877 into the 1940s is we see a significant increase in the degree of racial segregation in the United States, to the point where there's very little interaction between racial and ethnic groups. And when the infrequent interaction occurs, infrequently as it is, it's highly unequal. This is a period of time in which a lot of the oppression is taking a kind of multidimensional form. A really good example of this would be sort of the collaborative way in which policies specific to the Jim Crow era, the almost complete and total domination of politics, especially in the former Confederate states, by whites, and the use of extrajudicial terror organizations like the Klan, who will engage in terror tactics, will engage in sort of extra legal racial oppression, as a way of sort of helping to keep communities of color, especially blacks, kind of in line, right? The period of lynchings in America kind of really explode in this late 1800s, early 1900s era. We have some of the worst race massacres in American history. We have, for example, Wilmington, or we have Tulsa in 1921. We have Red Summer in 1919, in which a number of different cities had race riots and race massacres. So the way that these organizations operate, we're going to get into those details a little bit later in the semester, but I want to make sure that everyone understands that this period of racial oppression isn't just that there are a whole bunch of policies in place. Those policies are being written by and enforced on the legal side by the white power structure, which represents the interests of the aristocracy that existed prior to the Civil War. Right? Those people were not divested of their property. Those people were not, in any way stripped of their power. The only real significant change is that you can no longer legally practice chattel slavery. Although, as we talked about in class, you've got ways in which you can use prison labor, for example, and the chain gang as a ongoing system of uncompensated labor. The only place in the Constitution where it's still legal to practice slavery is in prisons. So this high degree of segregation, coupled with the sort of the legal oppression by law, right, the de jure oppression that occurs as a result of Jim Crow laws and other policy that are put in place, and then when people start to agitate, when people start to push back, the Klan shows up and they burn a cross on your front yard, or they lynch one of your family members as a way of sending a warning to you. Now, you might say, okay, so why don't you go report these people to the police, right? Well, the problem is the guy in the hood standing on your front lawn burning that cross is the sheriff, and everyone knows it, right? The hood is just sort of a theatrical denial of or plausible deniability. But everybody knows, there's a kind of a wink and a nod to know that that during the day they're going to oppress you through the law, and at night they're going to oppress you through the operation of these terror organizations like the Klan. So that's facilitated significantly by the high degree of racial segregation, because it's very hard to engage in those kinds of behaviors in mixed race neighborhoods. But as these groups become increasingly segregated and separated from one another, it becomes easy for people who live among the dominant group to sort of pretend like, or sometimes not even really know what's happening in these other communities because there's very little contact between those groups. So when it comes to value consensus then, or value conflict, what we see is that there is increasing racial conflict, right? Whereas before, under paternalism, while there was a lot of tension, it was masked by sort of the appearance of consensus, right? A certain degree of forced conformity leads everybody to sort of be able to paint a picture in which everyone's kind of getting along. But under the rigid competitive pattern of racial oppression, we begin to see racial conflict appearing sort of out and in the open. And usually it takes the form of sort of occasional violent outbursts. So like, again, Tulsa in May of 1921 is a very good example of this, right? In which, a mob assembles at the courthouse for the purposes of trying to, abduct this incarcerated young black man to lynch him for some alleged crime that he may have committed against a white woman. A group of black Tulsans appear in front of the courthouse to try to defend this young man, and a skirmish breaks out between the crowd of whites and the blacks who had assembled in front of the courthouse. That was followed later that evening by white Tulsans sort of en masse, sort of entering the north side of the city, which is where the African American population was segregated to, right? They all lived on the north side of the city, and they proceeded to burn that part of the city to the ground. They murdered hundreds of people. They destroyed, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars worth of property. Right, and so those kinds of outbursts reveal the degree to which there is not a lot of value consensus, right? That it's becoming increasingly obvious to people in both groups that this situation is untenable for the people in the subordinated groups, and efforts increasingly turn toward sort of oppressing or repressing any impulses among the subordinated group to try to rise up and change their circumstances or address the injustices that they're experiencing. So next time we will talk a little bit about the last of these three patterns of racial oppression, which is, as I've said, the fluid competitive pattern. So until then, I will say goodbye.